I'm on a very short leash tonight because I once went over my limit and was banned for years afterwards. So I don't want any to lose even a second here. I'm Mike Mewshaw, or Michael Mewshaw, or Dr. Mewshaw. You could refer to me in any way you like. I'm here tonight to talk about a different kind of influence. I've written books before that were, or novels that were based on previous novels. My third novel, The Toll, was based on Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. And I wrote a book called Island Tempest, which obviously it was set on a small island here in Florida that was based on Shakespeare's The Tempest. And I wrote a novel called Lying with the Dead, which was a retelling of the Oresteia set in suburban Washington, D.C., out in Maryland. But I'm going to talk about a different kind of influence, which, we're not always influenced by classical writers or even by the greatest writers. Pat Conroy is a writer I hope most of you are familiar with. He wrote The Great Santini and Prince of Tides and Beach Music. The Water is Wide, which was later made into a movie called Conrack, The Lords of Discipline, which was also a movie. And he became a kind of icon of survival of family abuse or of parental abuse. He spent much of his life writing about it and talking about having been savagely abused by his father, who was a Marine Corps pilot, and I guess emotionally abused in some ways by his mother, whom he deeply loved. Having been an abused child, he dealt with it mostly in person with self-deprecating humor, and he was a sort of manic talker and tireless narrator of stories. Some of them much too tall to be true, others all too true so true that they would leave scars. And he wasn't just a gifted soliloquist, he also listened intensely. Given the fact that he was a talker and a listener, the telephone was for him a piece of equipment as requisite as a breathing device for an underwater diver. He had a whole group of friends that he used to call at all hours of day and night and would talk for hours on the phone. And I was one of them. He called us his go-to guys. Pat was a basketball player on into college and was a point guard. So when he said we were his go-to guys, I could imagine him feeding the ball to his teammates, setting them up, as it were. Pat called me in 1981. I was living in Rome, and I got a call, remarkably, from this guy whom I didn't at first recognize. I wasn't familiar really with his work. I knew the titles, and I mistakenly thought it was Frank Conroy on the phone and began praising Stop Time. And he said no, that he was the other guy, and that he had just arrived in Rome and was feeling very, very deracinated, and he said quite frankly, he said, I need a friend. I need somebody to help me. And he said, I'd like you to come to lunch at my house this Sunday and bring your wife, bring anybody, bring a friend. He said, I'll give you food. He said, I'll give you money. And then he said, bewilderingly said, I'll give you a blowjob. And this is not the sort of thing that you usually hear from somebody that you've never met, or even somebody that you've met. But Linda and I and our kids and another couple, Steve Geller, who's a screenwriter, and his kids, we all drove out to where Pat was living with his wife, his second wife, Lenore, who was then pregnant. And he had a whole batch of kids from previous marriages, her previous marriage and his previous marriage, and they were living in a godforsaken community called Olgiata, which was, of all things, a suburb of Rome. I mean, a kind of gated community, as the sort of thing that didn't exist in Rome in those days. And it was mainly inhabited by corporate executives and diplomats and wealthy people. It was built around a golf course, and there were many swimming pools. And Pat had it in his mind, self-dramatizer that he was, that this was a mafia compound. And although we said to him, well, your neighbors are diplomats and corporate executives, he stuck by that. And I noticed that in his posthumously published autobiography, his oral biography, My Exaggerated Life, he continues to refer to Olgiata as a mafia compound. This indicates something about Pat, who was, if nothing else, an autobiographical writer. In his novels, you could see where he could massage the truth, but he was also a writer of memoirs and of supposedly factual books, and you could never quite tell where the line of truth was with him. This became a problem not only in his life, but certainly in our relationship. But at any rate, we went out to have lunch with Pat, and he was a terrific cook. My feeling was real men don't cook because, or at least I explained I didn't cook because I would be cross-dressing within 2 weeks if I started cooking. But Pat was so masculine that he could cook, and he did cook. Shortly thereafter, he was leaving Rome to go up to Munich to pick up a car that he had bought, and he was going to rent a car and drive up there. We barely knew one another, but he said to me, why don't you come along? And he said, it'll be like A Movable Feast when Hemingway and Fitzgerald took that ride, if you all are familiar with that book, A Movable Feast. Now, there's a famous scene in there where Fitzgerald expresses doubts about the size of his penis, and Hemingway takes him into the men's room and checks him out and says, it's okay, it's all right. But Pat said to me, remember that scene? He said, I won't show you mine, I promise. He said, but it is little. And Pat was forever saying things like that. And I think that, in a way, it was to get a laugh, but I think it was also a form of something that Pat became celebrated for, and it's an envy preemption. I think, above all, he never wanted anybody to feel envious of him, so that whatever happened to him, or whatever good fortune befell him, he had a way of devaluing or speaking of in a self-deprecating way. If you looked at his life objectively, or his childhood, it was nothing but successful. I mean, he was a terrific athlete, even though toward the end of his life he was a chubby, out-of-shape guy. He was good enough to play Division I college basketball, was the captain of his team, was the most valuable player on the team. In high school, he was a sensation in South Carolina. He once scored 55 points. And he won all the academic prizes, both in high school and at the Citadel. Yet when you read what he's written or to hear him talk about it, his life was sort of one stumbling failure after another. I think maybe that was partly a result of his being abused as a kid. But as I said, I think it's also because he felt insecure about success. Some people feel or fear failure, and Pat, I think, had a large measure of fear of success. He made a whole lot of money in his life, but he wound up giving it away. When I first met him, he was in his mid-30s. He was 35, and he told me once that he already had loaned members of his family and friends over $800,000. I say loaned, I mean, these were unsecured loans that he never got back. That's a huge amount of money. But as I said, I think he felt insecure being wealthy, and you think he later on, much as he craved attention and celebrity, I think he felt insecure about his success. On our trip north, that's drive, we talked for 12 hours straight, driving as far as Innsbruck, and learned a great deal about each other. We were both Irish Catholics. We're both avid basketball players, but both of us came from were sort of military brats who came from military families, and also we shared in common being abused children. And I remember Pat said, in my case, it was my mother who was physically abusive. And he said, well, that's got to be tough. And I said, but I bet your father could hit harder than my mother. And he said, still, what's the worst thing she ever did to you? And I said, I remember coming home late one time when I was 6 or 7 years old, and she had called me to come in, and I didn't come in right away. And as I came in the door, she took my head, she grabbed my hair, and banged my head against the wall. And he said, ooh. He said, that's funny, because my brother's first memory of me is of my father lifting me up by the throat and banging my head against the wall. So we were joined at the hip then. I mean, we realized we had so much in common. It later turned out that when his father was stationed at the Pentagon, my stepfather, the guy who raised me, ran the Naval Exchange Laundry and did the Conroy family's laundry. And he said, so, you washed my family's socks and underwear. Nothing is a more intimate connection than that. And, but it turned out there was a more intimate connection than that, and that it came out that during Pat's years in college, when he was at the Citadel, I think he was a junior at the time, he fell in love with a local girl in Charleston, who it turned out was pregnant by somebody else. And he stayed with her during that period of time and helped her while she was having this baby. And the thought was that she would give the baby away and they would then get married. It didn't work out that way. He wrote about this in his second novel, The Lords of Discipline. And soon after she gave birth to this child, and it turned out to be a stillbirth, she kissed him off, and that was it. Well, the same thing had happened to me in my junior year in college, and my second novel, Waking Slow, was about a similar experience of falling in love with a girl who was pregnant by somebody else. And so this began to really weird us both out. We figured that we had been separated at birth. And I remember that night in Innsbruck at dinner, I said to him, why do you think that girl that you were in love with, who was presumably in love with you, why do you think she ditched you? And he said, I know why, that she later came to a reading that I gave and asked me to sign a book, and I thought if she had the nerve to do that, I had the nerve to say, why did you dump me? And she said, because you remind me of the worst time in my life, and if we had stayed together, I would have been reminded every day of the most painful thing in my life. And this gave me a way, I think, of understanding what had happened to me. But I thought it was an interesting insight that he could bring there, which later has relevance to our relationship. But there we are in Innsbruck. We get a room together, not a double bed, single beds. But Pat spent hours before he went to sleep writing in his journal. He was a very, very meticulous diary keeper. And he then got up and went to take a shower, but left on the night table between us his journal open. And I know you're not supposed to read other people's journals, but this seemed to me a curious kind of Freudian invitation. And so I looked over there, and Pat had written down virtually everything that we had talked about that day. His powers of recall were in one way miraculous and accurate, but in another way not, because in significant ways, everything that I had told him had been subtly or not too subtly changed. Everything had been fictionalized. Now, this is a diary. You don't, many writers keep diaries, but they don't fictionalize their diaries. But Pat, in each case, sort of rounded off stories. I remember he asked me about my own basketball career, which I was sort of aborted. I would have at best been able to play Division III basketball. And he said, what did you have, white man's disease? And I said, no, I could jump. And he said, could you dunk? And I mean, you all know what dunking is, of course. And I said, actually, there's a story attached to that. I wanted to dunk. I could jump, but I couldn't palm the basketball. But what I wanted to do more than anything was to run out in the pregame drills and have a basketball in my hand and dunk it. So what I did was deflate the ball a bit so that I could palm it, and ran out and dunked it, never understanding quite that it would fall to the floor and then be like a, it would just be like a beanbag, you know. But Pat's version of this, I mean, I had told this story on myself, but Pat's version of this was Michael Mewshaw is the first and perhaps only novelist that I know who could once dunk a basketball, but he didn't put in that it was actually dunking a beanbag. But there were other stories that I told him. I had gone to a Catholic boys' high school, and Pat himself had gone to Gonzaga High School in Washington, D.C., and I had gone to a school called DeMatha. Pat swore that he had seen me play basketball, and I felt this was most improbable, but he wanted to know all about what DeMatha was like. Gonzaga was a school a Jesuit school for sort of upper crust kids. His father, after all, was an officer in the Marine Corps. DeMatha at that time was a kind of blue-collar school and was famous for, or infamous for, the brattiness or the delinquencies of its student body. And so there was much talk about fights. I mean, why this came up with two 35-year-old men, I don't know. But I described various fights and acts of violence that had been perpetrated in this high school. And one of them was really legendary, and it was there was a very, very tough football player. His name was Porky, of all things. And Porky had a girlfriend, and she couldn't get away from him because if she did, he would beat up the person who went out with his girlfriend. And a wimpy guy on the football team who was on the third string and was notorious for being a non-hitter had the temerity to begin dating Porky's girlfriend. So Porky, as they said in those days, called heads on him and said, meet me after school. And this guy, Billy, showed up after school, which was a miracle itself, but he brought with him an axe handle. And Porky said, you don't have the nerve. That was the last thing he got out of his mouth. The guy fractured his skull and knocked 17 of his teeth out. So Pat was much taken with this. He said, Billy could really hit, couldn't he? He was a hitter. I mention this because that was, of course, in Pat's notes, as was a lot of other information about the episode, which I had never told him, and he certainly didn't know, such as how much each guy weighed, how tall he was, what his nickname was, and all this other stuff. And Pat later used that episode in Beach Music, and he made that episode his own by changing the axe handle to a baseball bat. So this is the way Pat. I also told him about. This is under the influence here. You know, I told him many stories, but I told him a story that I knew a guy who I had known who was a Marine who had claimed to have killed a child in Korea to keep from being captured. And that story, too, was in Pat's notebook. And he later used it in The Prince of Tides. And Pat had asked me to read an early draft of The Prince of Tides, and the story was in there. And I said, Pat, I really think you need to cut that because I've used that very episode in the novel I wrote called The Toll, which was based on Bell Tolls. And he said, oh, okay. I said, I feel free to use whatever you want from me, but I think if you don't eliminate that, somebody might say that you're plagiarizing. And Pat said, good enough, good enough. And then when I read the book when it came out, he had changed the episode, and he made the child a woman. so as I say, Pat's, I'd like to think, was deeply influenced by me, but influenced in a curious way. Later on, when I turned 40, and this is a birthday that millions of people remember, millions, only because Pat put the birthday party into his novel Beach Music, and it had millions of readers. And this was a party at my threadbare apartment in Rome, a place that was on the top floor, but I wouldn't call it a penthouse. It was more like an illegal habitation built on top of a building. And when the wind blew, the curtains in the apartment would go sideways like this. But we had a lot of interesting people there, including Gore Vidal, who was sort of the star of the evening. And unbeknownst to Pat, Vidal and he had a lot more in common than either was aware. Vidal was born at West Point. His father was a famous athlete at Army, was an All-American in football and in basketball, participated in, I think it's the 1928 Olympics, later coached football at Army. And of course, Vidal was from a Southern family, and although he was a patrician, not a country boy like Pat, the South was very much a part of his character. So I thought it would be interesting to introduce them. And Vidal came to this party in his usual uniform of blue blazer and gray slacks. Pat was in his usual uniform, which was a sort of check woolen shirt, excuse me, and that would have been interesting, actually. Gore would have liked that, but it was bad enough as it was, but he always wore khaki pants, Pat did. And I introduced them, and Vidal surprised me, because he wasn't one to praise other people's work, but he said that he had read Pat's book, The Lords of Discipline, which was set at the Citadel, about a military school. And he said, I quite liked it. And he said, Pat said, thank you. And he said, I love that idea of the guys together in the dorm. And he said, but the thing that you didn't really declare your real theme, which was those guys were clearly having sex with one another. And Pat said, this will come as a great surprise to my roommate. And he said, no, come on. Certainly that was the case. I mean, those guys, military school, they're doing nothing but banging each other. So that was the meeting between Vidal and Pat Conroy. Now, I thought it was an interesting meeting that could stand on its own, chiseled in stone. But when Pat retold the episode, as he retold many episodes in his novels, he had a scene in Beach Music where the narrator, Jack, who's a freelance journalist living in Rome, whose specialty is travel writing, and his venues are the New York Times Sophisticated Traveler and a magazine called European Travel and Life, which were my primary support in those days. So we took my job and gave it to this guy, and then he had the guy go to a party at the penthouse or in the palace of a couple called Paris and Linda Shaw. And they were a wealthy couple living in Rome. He had previously called them in the early drafts of the manuscript Mike and Linda Mewshaw, but his editor said, don't do that. But and in the novel, when he meets Gore Vidal looks down and sees that this guy Jack has come with his daughter, and what he says is, this girl is beautiful, she should always wear pearls. Now that's the fictional version of Pat's encounter with Gore Vidal. And I think if anything indicates why he became a bestseller and I didn't, it's that he knew what people liked to read. People liked to go to palaces and meet rich people who say that their daughter is beautiful. They don't like to go to read about people going and being told that they were having sex with their roommate at a military school. Pat and I became great friends. We used to walk around the city together while I was trying to get information to write up in my column for European Travel and Life when I was doing a letter from Rome. But then his family life got very complicated. His wife, Lenore's previous husband, began suing them for custody of the children. Pat rode forth and fought this custody battle and fought it for over a decade. And he left Rome. And I remember it shows something about the nature of our relationship and its importance to him as well. Is he wrote me after he had left Rome, and he said, "We had a nice thing going, a life-changing friendship that has 4 distinct parts like a weather vane, and it all moves in harmony, and we know how all the winds of the world are blowing when we get together. The full diminishment of losing you has not hit me yet, and I don't think I could stand it if I faced it fully now. But what magic the world is full of. As I sit here," and he was then in Atlanta, "with kudzu growing outside of his window," he said, "hoping to write again, I feel that old love of Mewshaw flowing off the desk, lifting above the city, sailing eastward and lighting like a bird on your terrace overlooking the city. I want that bird to sing to you, Mike, to thank you for everything, to sing his little ass off and let you know how much we miss you." He was a very touching, lovely guy, full of warmth and affection. And every time I mention Pat to anyone, they always say right away, "I loved Pat," even if they'd only met him once, or "I met Pat once and he embraced me, hugged me." I felt that way about him too. I did so literally for 14 years. And before we moved back to the States, it was family matters that dragged us back there, but I remember realizing in the fall of 1988 that we were going to have to leave, and meant we had to see Pat in the States. And I remember I was writing a book called True Crime, and I had rented an office in downtown in the center of Rome, and I lived up on the Giunicolo on a hill above the city, and I used to walk down every day to this office, and as I walked, I used to feel that since I was leaving the city, that I was particularly taken with what I was passing, and that was entering me in a way that it hadn't before. And now that I knew I'd be leaving, I wanted to carry away a map of Rome in my heart. And even as I stored up impressions of Rome, I stoked up memories of Pat Conroy, who used to be such a big part of my life in Rome. Though he was no longer present, I clung to him as best I could. If I were an artist, I suppose I would have painted his portrait. What I had were words, and I cloned him in my new book, True Crime, without realizing that at the same time he was cloning me in beach music. Both of us borrowed key phrases, anecdotes, and incidents from the other. My book was set in Maryland, much of the action on a marshy island on the Chesapeake Bay, which could have been the low country of South Carolina, actually. The plot revolved around events that had shaped Pat and me as surely as our DNA: a drunken, violent father, adolescent devotion to basketball, a college girlfriend who gets pregnant by another guy. Every story point of True Crime sprang from conversations with Pat, those that we had had as we walked the streets of Rome, surrounded by lapidary lines carved in stone. I depicted the narrator's brother, a burly, wisecracking public defender, as much like Pat as wish fulfillment and my talent would allow. it was just to show that it wasn't always a one-way street and that Pat was borrowing from me. There was a story that his wife, Lenore, told me about her divorce from her malignant first husband, who she caught in bed with her best friend. And he naturally did that thing that all men do when they're caught. And he said, oh, Jesus, it's not what you think, he said. And he jumped out of bed, but she just ran downstairs and got into her car, and he ran and stood naked in front of the car and said, let me explain. And she said, get out of the way. And he said, no. And she stepped on the gas and ran over him. I thought, well, this is a story that must live as long as men speak and read English. So I stole that one before Pat could use it. Publishers Weekly, when they read my book, said that it was essentially a love story. But like many love stories, it didn't end happily. In 1994, as I say, 14 years into our relationship, Pat called me in tears from South Carolina. I was then living in Charlottesville, and asked me to call Lenore, who was in their primary home in San Francisco, and tell her he wanted a divorce. And I said, well, I think that's really not on. It's above my pay grade. And he said, you've got to do it. You've got to do it. Pat's brother, I should mention, his youngest brother, had committed suicide 3 weeks earlier. Pat was in a terrible mood. And he said, I'll commit suicide if you don't do this for me. I said, why don't you do it? And he said, because she'll talk me out of it, but she'll take you at your word, and that'll be good. So I did what he asked me to do. I called her, and I told her this. And he said, call me back as soon as you've spoken to her. I called him back, and he didn't answer. I never saw Pat Conroy again in my life. He completely ghosted me. And it made me think of that discussion we had had about girlfriends who dumped us in college. I think this episode, the idea of the great Santini's son not having the courage to ask his own wife for a divorce, played a part in this rupture between us. Well, Pat and I did exchange emails later in life once that was invented, once the internet was invented. And he came to me many years later and asked me, I had been writing on a book that he found out through his agent was about the various writers I had known in my life who influenced me. And it was men like Styron and Robert Penn Warren and Paul Bowles and Anthony Burgess and Gore Vidal and Graham Greene. I mean, these were people I actually knew. And he suggested that I do a chapter about us and about our relationship, painful as it would be. And in effect, this is a book that answers that request. It's after his death, but I've done what he asked me to do, and I've written about our relationship, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Thank you very much. I'm told we have time for two questions if you have questions.
Yes, please stand to ask your question and wait for the microphone to come to you.
Oh, how you're hurting me. No one cares enough. Yeah.
Here we go.
Where's that mic? Here's somebody. Ben. Okay. Well, you're first. You're second. Then. Yes.
I'm curious about the stories you had about being abused, both Pat Conroy by his father and you by your mother.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you write about that, because I think it's very powerful writing and difficult to express on paper.
To write about the abuse?
Yes. Did you write about that?
Yes. I mean, this is a memoir, or as Vidal used to like to call them, a memoir. So it's more about me than you might think. But yes, I do write about my mother, and I do write about our relationship and how I dealt with it and how it developed over my life. And so, yes, I do write about it. And of course, Pat wrote about it to a fare thee well in his books. Yes, you had a question. And I agree with you. It's difficult to write about abuse, about child abuse, if you were the abusee.
Hi,
Hi.
Jesuit, Irish Catholic, had a friend like you and Pat. Do you sometimes, when you read or think about it, do you just start to cry?
Yes. Is that a question?
It is.
I was not given in those days to crying. I'm more given to it now. Pat was a great crier, though. Yes, he was and when I think about our relationship now, yes, it makes me extraordinarily sad, because although we had a correspondential relationship in the last years of our life, we didn't see one another. And I spend the last bit of the book writing about Pat coming down with pancreatic cancer and dying, and my writing him a letter to say, well, there's unfinished business between us. And his daughter, who is my goddaughter, gave him this letter, and he, from his deathbed, said, tell Mike I was thinking about him. And that was it. That was it. Yes, it could make you cry. Thank you.